we are back with another update and forecast on the Gifford fire. All week long, we've been talking about how it's going to be getting warmer and drier and how that's going to lead to increased fire activity. And here you can see that that forecast has pretty much come true. Definitely seeing an increase in activity today compared to yesterday. So throughout this video, we're going to try to figure out where on the fire is it the most active, and then given the weather forecast, how active are we expecting it to be in the future, and also what direction do we expect the fire to grow. Now, first question for the Gifford fire is where is it? So we can zoom in here. It's well north of Los Angeles. It's more near San Luis Obispo, about 15 miles northeast of Santa Maria. That might make more sense if you know the area. Also, if you're in the area, always stay updated with your evacuation orders and warnings. I don't go into those in these videos though, because by the time a lot of people are watching this, those might have changed. We'll just briefly go over some of the new numbers here because it doesn't actually tell us all that much. For example, the acreage certainly jumped up, but we don't actually know how that jumped up. So we're almost up to 100,000 acres, but I did find this cool progression map that actually shows how this fire has been changing over time. If you look very close at the very dark, kind of the dark blue color, that's where the fire started around August 2nd, and then that teal color, pardon if I'm a little colorblind here, is August 3rd, and then that light green color is August 4th. That orange and red is going to be the growth from August 5th. And this is just based on kind of when they're able to do these mapping operations. So the jump up in our acreage that we saw yesterday is, or most recently, is going to be a lot of that orange and red color, which I notice is mostly on the northern side, but then we did still have some growth in this area of the wilderness on the southern edge of the fire. Key thing that I do notice though, very little growth on the eastern side of the fire and not actually much on this southern finger that we were originally pretty worried about over the last 2 days. Now the other thing that we can look at is containment is up to 15%, and that kind of goes along with that progression map we were just looking at, where we haven't seen that much recent activity on this western side or this eastern side. It's that eastern side that's pushing into the Madre fire burn scar, and it's one of the actually benefits of fires. When you have a fire come through, it clears out the vegetation. So when a new fire comes, there's nothing to burn. So that's part of the reason that eastern side doesn't have a lot of that orange to red on that progression map. And then it's also part of the reason that we have black on that part of the containment map. So anywhere where you see red, that's uncontained. And then, for example, on this western side where it's black, that's where the fire is contained. And you can see 166 basically cuts right through that fire. Then we can, before we move on, I should say, if you want a great analysis on fire behavior, you can watch this operational video right there that Watch Duty posted about 6 hours ago. He used some great analogies to help understand how fires create their own weather. So I found that video helpful. What I also find helpful is just looking at the fire from satellite imagery, because just right off the bat, you take one look at this and you can tell it's more active than yesterday. There's more smoke coming off of the fire, and you can also tell the wind direction. It looks like our winds are a bit more southwesterly today because you see that smoke moving towards the northeast. And it also seems like that smoke's moving a little faster, which might tell us that it is a little bit windier out there. The other thing we can do is turn on natural color fire, and you can roughly see that orange glow. That's always a bit tricky to actually tell where that is on the fire though. So that's what I use this map for. Start off with fire perimeter, then we will put on the modus and veers. This tells us where some of the heat has been recently. Any of the yellow to orange stars, that's going to be where there was heat on the fire more than 24 hours ago. The red stars are going to be in the last 24 hours. So this is where I'd say there's some very clear good news and bad news. The good news, most of this fire hasn't actually seen heat in the last 24 hours. I mean, on these edges, there is still going to be some smoldering, but big flames like the kind you'd see on the news, that's actually really just been on this northwestern corner in the last 24 hours. So that's why I always say these acreage numbers aren't actually all that helpful, because you hear 100,000 acres, the fires incredibly dangerous. But then if you're in Kuyama, that southern area of the fire that's closest to you basically looks like it's out. So while the acreage jumped up by 20,000 acres, I mean, you look at where the fire is burning and the threat has actually diminished for you. So that's part of the reason I love this map. Then I also like it because it can show us where the structures are. And there are structures to the west of where we do have a lot of this fire activity, but it does look like we still have some distance. I regret every single time I go to use these ruler tools in the live stream because it never seems to work, but it finally worked for us. So it's about 8 kilometers or 5 miles. We'll use miles. We're in America. 5 miles to the west of where we're seeing a lot of that heat activity is where we have that cluster of structures right there. Down there, that's probably going to be a bit more like 6 to 7 miles, although there are a few structures shown with those orange dots closer to the fire. What else we can do is turn on the most recent heat activity. So this is the one that's going to be sometimes within the last 15 to 30 minutes. However, it also always overestimates the fire because it picks up on some of the heat that's in the smoke. And these boxes are just rather large, but it's helpful to see where we're currently seeing heat on the fire. So good news for the southern edge, eastern edge, southwestern edge. Not seeing any of those yellow, orange, or red boxes, which means the fire hasn't flared back up again in those areas. Love to see that. But then when we zoom in here, that's a fairly active fire. I'd say that definitely looks more active than what we were looking at yesterday. And it's not a huge surprise because we have a lot of factors working against us today. Topography, dry fuel, and weather all aligning for high fire danger. So it's amazing the work that they have done to at least calm the fire down in all these other parts of the fire. So I just mentioned topography, fuels, and weather. Now let's actually check those out. So what we can do is zoom in to this northern side of the fire. It seemed like it was especially active right around here. So I'm interested to see what kind of topography we have. This kind of paints the picture of what they're dealing with there. That's some very steep topography. Imagine being a crew trying to work in that. And what often happens too is the fire will get established on the bottom of a slope, and then it's able to quickly rush up the slope, especially something like this slope, because the winds are going to be aligning with it coming from the southwest. So the fire is going to be preheating fuels as it moves up this hill, and then you're also going to have wind pushing up this hill, and that's just going to lead to some rapid growth, which is exactly what we're seeing on that exact area of the fire. Now, I will say though, they do have some aircraft on it. Right there, you can see a helicopter probably dropping some water as we speak, which is sometimes you can actually see them on these videos. So this video is definitely from that northwestern section of the fire that we were looking at earlier. If you have really good eyes, you might be able to see one of the helicopters flying through there. Next thing we can do is look at the weather, because that kind of plays into our fuels. I was listening to that video earlier, and he said because of how hot it's been, because of how dry it's been, the grasses and a lot of the fuels in this area are so dry that if you were to throw 100 cigarettes or 100 matches, it would start 100 fires. And then we also know that when you have some wind, it's able to pick up burning embers, drop them into those dry fuels, and then that can start little spot fires and lead to faster spread. So that's where weather really does play a big role in terms of how much growth you get on a fire. Today, as I mentioned earlier, one of the hottest days, maybe the hottest day that we were talking about this entire week. We had a warming trend through especially Tuesday, Wednesday, then now we're into Thursday. And I mean, right here, this point forecast that we just used is showing mid-90s. Relative humidity, because we're getting hotter, is going to be drier because warm air can hold more moisture. So it's almost like you have the same amount of moisture, but then a much bigger sponge. So overall, that sponge is going to be drier than if you have a tiny sponge. Winds have been fairly consistent, 10 to 20 miles per hour in the afternoon. That's actually the one part of the forecast that hasn't been terrible when it comes to weather. No big wind events on the horizon either. And it actually looks like it is going to get a little bit cooler. You see, Friday, Saturday, dropping into the high 80s instead of the 90s. I don't know how much of a difference that's actually going to make, though, because it's still going to be fairly dry with even though we're dropping a few degrees. So here's the forecast. Let's kind of see basic summary of what we just said. For today, very hot and dry conditions are expected with temperatures around low 90s to even some triple digits out there. You're going to have a lot of variation in your weather forecast when you have a fire this big. And humidity in the 10 to 20% with localized minimums in the single digits. Then southwesterly up canyon winds can be expected with gusts in the 15 to 20 mile per hour range. So we knew it was southwesterly because we saw the direction that the smoke was going. And then we talked about up canyon because we zoomed in here and we thought about the fact that that fire with those winds is going to be aligned to move up slope. Then getting into this last one, this kind of is our forecast moving forward. For Friday and Saturday, some slight cooling is expected, so that's good, but conditions will remain very dry. Early next week, temperatures will warm up with humidity remaining low, but no significant wind events are expected. So good news, slightly cooler over the next 2 days. Bad news, looks like we're going to be warming up right as we get into the beginning of next week. Looks like even Sunday, it looks like we're back into those low 90s. Good news, though, is that there's no significant wind expected. The other good news is that, right now, the fire is not active in the places that are closest to the largest amount of structures. I always try to look for some silver lining there, although based on that activity on this northwestern side and those clusters of structures we have about 5 miles away, definitely keeping a close eye on this. And then the last piece of good news, total personnel is almost up to 3,000, which is a small army on this fire right now. And we've seen them using all kinds of aircraft, dozers, but they're basically throwing everything we have at this fire. So a lot of good work being done there. Thanks to all the people working on this fire, doing the hard work in some pretty extreme heat. And it looks like this thing's going to be active at least a few more days. I wouldn't be surprised if it goes another week. So I'll try to keep these updates coming